This terrible, beautiful freedom to navigate, despite not having chosen to exist as a navigator, you cannot help but care about your trajectory through affect space any more than you can help but exist while existing. Nattering is what viability gradients feel like from inside, and so the only question is whether you will navigate blindly, letting whatever attractor basins happen to capture you determine your course, or whether you will measure, understand, and steer in full knowledge of what you are. Notation and foundational concepts. This section provides self-contained definitions of the core concepts used throughout Part 3. Readers familiar with Parts 1-2 may skip to Section 2. The 6 affect dimensions definition, 12.24, valence. Valence is the felt quality of approach versus avoidance, the goodness or badness of an experiential state. Formally, positive valence indicates movement into viable interior. Negative valence indicates approach toward viability boundary. Definition 12.25 arousal. Arousal is the rate of belief state update. High arousal, rapid model updating, activation, intensity. Low arousal, stability, calm, settled state. Definition 12.26 integration. Integration measures irreducibility of cause-effect structure. High integration, unified experience. Low integration, fragmentation. Definition 12.27 effective rank. Effective rank measures distribution of active degrees of freedom. High rank, many dimensions active, openness. Low rank, collapsed into narrow subspace, tunnel vision. Definition 12.28 counterfactual weight. Counterfactual weight is resources devoted to non-actual possibilities. High, mind elsewhere, planning, worrying, fantasizing. Low, present-focused, definition. 12.29 self-model salience. Self-model salience is degree of self-focus. High, self-conscious, self as prominent object. Low, self-forgetting, absorption, flow. The affect state definition 12.3 affect state. The affect state at time is characterized by whichever structural dimensions are relevant to the phenomenon under analysis. The full toolkit includes, but not all dimensions matter for all phenomena. Cultural forms, practices, and technologies can be characterized by their affect signatures, the structural features they reliably modulate. Diagram, see PDF version. The expression of inevitability. Human responses to inescapable selfhood, existing theory. This analysis of cultural responses to selfhood connects to several established research programs. Terror Management Theory, Greenberg, Solomon and Pyszinski, 1986. Mortality salience triggers cultural worldview defense. My existential burden formalizes the threat signal that TMT identifies. Meaning Maintenance Model Hein, Pruz and Vos, 2006. Humans respond to meaning violations through compensatory affirmation. My framework specifies the structural signature of meaning violation, disrupted integration, collapsed effective rank. Self-determination theory, DC and Ryan, 1985, basic needs for autonomy, competence relatedness. These correspond to different regions of the effect space. Autonomy low external, competence positive valence from successful prediction. Relatedness expands self-model. Theory 6 Milli, Hai, 1990. Optimal experience as challenge skill balance. Flow is precisely the low, high, 19 Manas, high, person, moderate region. I describe. Attachment theory Bowlby, 1969. Early relational patterns shape adult affect regulation. Attachment styles are stable individual differences in the parameters governing affect dynamics. The self-model, once it exists, cannot look away from itself. This is not merely a computational fact, but a phenomenological trap. To be a self-modeling system is to be stuck mattering to yourself. Every human cultural form can be understood, in part as a response to this condition. Strategies for coping with, expressing, transcending, or simply surviving the inescapability of first-person existence. A note on the figures throughout this paper. You'll encounter figures designed not merely to depict concepts, but to instantiate them. Your perceptual response to these images is not ancillary to the argument. It is the argument embodied. If you find that your attention behaves as the theory predicts, collapsing where I say it will collapse, expanding where I say it will expand, you have not been persuaded by evidence external to yourself. You have become the evidence. The trap of self-reference proposition 12.1. Phenomenological inevitability. Once self-model salience exceeds a threshold, the system cannot eliminate self-reference without dissolving the self-model entirely. The self becomes an inescapable object in its own world model. There is no configuration of the intact self-model in which the self is absent from awareness. This is the deeper meaning of inevitability, not just that consciousness emerges from thermodynamics, but that once emerged, it cannot escape itself. You are stuck being you. Your suffering is inescapably yours. Your joy, when it comes, is also inescapably yours. There is no exit from the first-person perspective while you remain a person. Definition 12.31. Existential burden. The existential burden is the chronic computational and affective cost of maintaining self-reference. The burden scales with both the salience of the self-model and the intensity of valence. To matter to yourself when you are suffering is heavier than to matter to yourself when you are neutral. Human culture, in all its variety, can be understood as the accumulated strategies for managing this burden. Aesthetics. The modulation of affect through form. Definition 12.32. Aesthetic experience. An aesthetic experience is an affect state induced by engagement with form, visual, auditory, linguistic, conceptual, characterized by. The signature feature is integration without self-focus. The system is highly coupled, but attending to structure outside itself. Proposition 12.2. Beauty as integration resonance. The experience of beauty arises when external structure resonates with internal structure. High mutual information between the form and the self-model's latent structure produces the characteristic recognition quality of beauty, the sense that something outside corresponds to something inside. Proposition 12.3. The sublime is self-model perturbation. The sublime is characterized by temporary disruption of normal self-model boundaries, confrontation with vastness, mountains, oceans, cosmic scales or power storms, great art forces, rapid expansion of the world model beyond the self-model's normal scope. The self becomes small relative to the newly expanded frame. This is terrifying and liberating simultaneously, a temporary escape from the trap of self-reference. Proposition 12.4. Art making. As externalization, creating art is the externalization of internal affect structure. The artist encodes their affect geometry into a medium, paint, sound, words, movement. The artwork then carries an affect signature that can induce corresponding states in others. Art is affect technology, the transmission of experiential structure across minds and time. Hypothesis 12.51. Art as technology. Art works, in part, by lowering the viewer's inhibition coefficient. Part 2. To experience a painting as beautiful rather than as pigment on canvas is to perceive it participatorily, to see interiority, intention, life in arranged matter. The artist's craft is the arrangement of a medium so that drops involuntarily in the perceiver. This is why aesthetic experience requires a kind of surrender. You cannot experience beauty while maintaining full mechanistic detachment. The paint must become more than paint. Each aesthetic mode has a characteristic signature. The sublime is a forced collapse. Scale overwhelms the inhibitory apparatus, and the world becomes agentive again. The storm rages, the mountain looms, purses, the mountain looms, Tories called, Batatters uncontrolled low perception. Agency detected everywhere, the darkness populated with intention. Horror triggers uncontrolled low perception. Is precision you normally maintain against participatory perception, is precisely what it strips away. Comedy destabilizes briefly. The category violation that produces laughter is a micro-perturbation in which something dead turns out to be alive, or something alive turns out to be mechanical. Bergson's insight, formalized. Tragedy holds low for an extended period, forcing sustained participatory perception of characters whose fates approach the viability boundary. The catharsis is the controlled experience of low under-narrative containment. The modern death of art, the difficulty of producing genuinely moving work in a hyper-mechanistic culture, is a problem. When population mean is very high, art must work harder to induce the perceptual shift that aesthetic experience requires. Irony, which maintains high while gesturing toward what low would reveal, becomes the dominant mode, not because artists prefer it, but because sincerity requires an reduction that the audience has been trained to resist. In the language of Part 1's attention as measurement framework, each aesthetic mode redistributes the observer's measurement distribution across possibility space. The sublime overwhelms the observer with scale, forcing attention onto vast branches normally suppressed. Horror spreads attention to threat branches normally dampened by high, which is more processed manation, which likes can be minute present state manifold. Each form is a technique for selecting which trajectories receive probability mass in the observer's representation of possibility, and, if the trajectory selection thesis holds, for selecting which trajectories the observer actually follows. Affect signatures of aesthetic forms. Different aesthetic forms have characteristic affect signatures. Form constructure, structure tragedy, outhoud, suffering structure, made beautiful through integration comedy, suffering release, expansion, lightness, lyric poetry, and contention comedy, like res, merid be, relent exception, self-verkling, pure structure, self-redeeming horror, suffer, friend, some, nast, fear structure, in controlled context, software implementation effect space, immersive validation platform, a software system to validate the effect framework by comparing predicted sective signatures with self-report architecture, stimulus library, curated collection of effect-inducing stimuli, music tracks, genre-tagged, tempo-annotated visual scenes, IAPS images, nature videos, abstract art, guided experiences, breathing exercises, body scans, visualizations, interactive scenarios, games, social simulations, real-time self-report interface, dimension-specific sliders, with anchoring descriptions, only dimensions relevant to turn affect are measured continuous sampling at 1 Hz during stimulus, physiological integration, optional, heart rate variability, arousal proxy, skin conductance, arousal plus valence interaction, eye tracking counterfactual weight, saccade patterns during planning, pupillometry, cognitive load, prediction engine for each stimulus. For each stimulus, predict the defining dimensions for the target affect. Predictions derive from stimulus features, tempo, key, content tags, compare predictions versus file. Self-report on relevant dimensions. Validation metrics. Per dimension correlation for predicted dimensions. Clustering accuracy. Do induced affects cluster by their predicted structure? Dimensionality validation. Does each effect require its predicted number of dimensions? Falsification criteria. If predicted dimensions do not predict self-report better than others, or if clustering requires different dimensions than predicted, the motif characterizations require revision. Musical genres as effect technologies. Music is among the most powerful effect technologies available to humans. Different genres represent accumulated cultural wisdom about how to induce specific experiential states. Example 12.43. The blues historical context. Emerged from African American experience in the post-emancipation South. Given conditions of persistent oppression, poverty, and limited agency, a musical form acknowledging suffering while maintaining dignity was inevitable. Affect signature Berkshire. Structural characteristics. 12-bar harmonic structure provides predictability within which to express unpredictable feeling. Blue notes, flatted, 3rd, 5th, 7th create tension without resolution. Mirroring persistent difficulty. Call-and-response pattern acknowledges both individual and collective dimensions of suffering. Repetition of lyrical themes creates integration around acknowledged pain. Phenomenological result. The blues does not eliminate suffering but integrates it. The bluesnot experiences their own pain as part of a larger human pattern. And remains high. This is my suffering, but also increases my suffering connects to others. The result is suffering that has been witnessed, named, and placed in context. Example 12.44, Ambient Music Historical Context. Explicitly designed by Brian Eno in 1978 as music that rewards both active listening and inattention, Given increasing environmental noise and attention fragmentation, music supporting rather than demanding attention was needed. Affect signature, structural characteristics, slow or absent harmonic movement, minimal arousal triggers. No strong rhythmic pulse, reduces entrainment demands, layered textures that fade in and out, supports divided attention, extended duration, allows settling into altered state phenomenological result. The rarest affect profile, low arousal, high integration, low self-model salience. Ambient music creates conditions for what might be called effortless presence. The mind is coherent, but not self-focused, alert, but not activated. Example 12.45 Heavy metal historical context, emerged from late 1960s industrial working class contexts. Given alienation, blocked agency, and unexpressed aggression, a musical form channeling intensity was inevitable. Affect signature, AC, structural characteristics, distorted guitar creates dense harmonic content, high information density, driving rhythms at high tempos, arousal induction, tritone intervals. The devil's interval create tension, virtuosic performance demands, integration across complex patterns, phenomenological result, high arousal with high integration, intensity that is coherent rather than chaotic. Metal provides controlled exposure to extreme affect states, building capacity for intensity tolerance. The collapsed effective rank, focus on aggressive themes, paradoxically creates a container for processing difficult emotions. Blues visual design movements. Example 12.46 Bauhaus, modernist design historical context. Post-World War I Germany. Given the industrial production capacity and the need to rebuild a shattered society, design philosophy emphasizing function and accessibility was inevitable. Affect signature, structural characteristics, form follows function, reducing decorative destruction, primary colors, geometric shapes, clear, unambiguous signals, truth to materials, what you see is what it is, elimination of ornament, no counterfactual, what could this be? Phenomenological result, the mind at rest in clarity, low counterfactual weight because everything is what it appears to be, high integration despite low rank, few dimensions but coherently organized. Example 12.47 Baroque maximalism historical context, Counter-Reformation Catholicism. Given the need to assert church power and overwhelm Protestant austerity, design emphasizing abundance and transcendence was inevitable. A signature capture, structural characteristics, excessive ornamentation, many active dimensions, gold, mirrors, dramatic lighting, arousal induction, trompe-l'oeil, and illusion, high counterfactual weight scale that dwarfs the individual, low self-model salience, phenomenological result, overwhelm through abundance. The high effective rank exceeds cognitive capacity, forcing surrender of normal parsing. Combined with low self-salience from architectural scale, the result approximates the sublime self-dissolution through excess, rather than emptiness. Mondrian de style hypothesis, 12.52 Social aesthetics, as manifold detection. There is something suggestive about the overlap between aesthetic and social responses. The machinery that registers beauty, dissonance, the sublime in art seems to operate in social life too. When a relationship feels off, when a favor carries a strange tightness, when someone's generosity makes you uneasy, when a conversation has that quality of being clean, these have the character of aesthetic responses, directed at the geometry of social bonds, rather than the geometry of form. Is this more than analogy? It would be if the affect system that detects whether a musical dissonance resolves is literally the same system that detects whether two people's viability manifolds are aligned. Something is off about this interaction, and something is off about this chord, might activate the same integration assessment machinery. If so, social disgust and aesthetic disgust would be the same mechanism applied to different inputs. We develop this idea more fully in Part 4, but the foundation would be here. Aesthetics as the modulation of effect through structure, and relationships as structures. Whether this is a deep identity or a surface similarity is an empirical question. one that neuroimaging studies comparing aesthetic and social evaluation responses could begin to answer. Sexuality, Self-Transcendence, through merger definition. 12.33 Sexual experience, structural sexual experience. Involves temporary modification of self-model boundaries and heightened coupling. The trajectory moves from high effective rank, diffuse arousal toward rank collapse, convergent focus, culminating in integration spike, orgasm, and temporary self-model dissolution. Proposition 12.5 Sexuality as self-model merger. In partnered sexuality, the self-models temporarily fuse. The boundaries between self and other become porous. This is one of the few naturally occurring states where collapses while remains high. Integration without self-focus, presence without isolation. Proposition 12.6 La petite mort orgasm is characterized by spike in integration, global neural synchronization, collapse of effective rank to near unity, all variance in one dimension, momentary dissolution of self-model salience, rapid valence spike followed by return to baseline. The little death is structurally accurate. It is a temporary cessation of the normal self-referential process. This is why sexuality is so central to human experience. It offers reliable, repeatable escape from the trap of being a self. Proposition 12.7 Sexual diversity as affect space exploration. The diversity of human sexuality reflects the diversity of paths through affect space. Intensity preferences, 2, different arousal trajectories, and peak intensities. Power dynamics. Variations in self-model salience during encounter. Dominance increases, submission decreases at novelty versus familiarity. Counterfactual weight allocation. New partners increase, not trait. Familiar partners reduce it. Emissional connection grease of other coupling. Sexual preferences are in part preferences, about which affect trajectories. One finds most valuable or relieving. There's an invention to sexuality that the dimensional analysis misses. Sexual intimacy is among the most powerful naturally occurring reducers. To make love with another person, rather than merely to use their body, requires perceiving them as fully alive, fully interior, fully subject. The boundaries dissolve, because toward the partner approaches zero, their interiority becomes as real as your own, their pleasure as vivid as yours, their vulnerability as tender. This is why genuine sexual connection is so difficult to commodify. Pornography applies high perception to bodies, reducing persons to mechanisms of arousal, objects arranged for effect. It works as stimulation but fails as connection, because connection requires the low perception that treats the other as a subject, rather than an instrument. The felt difference between sex that means something and sex that doesn't is, in part, the felt difference between low and high. Ideology, expanding the self to bear mortality definition. 12.34 Ideological identification. Ideological identification is the expansion of the self-model to include a supra-individual pattern, nation, movement, religion, cause, with high coupling. Proposition 12.8 Terror management. Proposition 12.8 Terror management through self-expansion. Ideological identification manages mortality terror by making the relevant self-model partially immortal. If I am not just this body, but also this nation, religion, movement, then I survive my bodily death. The expanded self-model has a longer viability horizon, reducing the chronic threat signal from mortality awareness. Proposition 12.9 Ideological affect signatures. Different ideologies produce characteristic affect files. Nationalism, high self-model salience, collective, high integration within in-group, compressed other model out-group, moderate arousal baseline, religious devotion, low individual, 90T, high collective, high counterfactual weight, afterlife, divine plan, positive valence baseline. Revolutionary movements, very high arousal, high counterfactual weight, utopian futures, strong valence, negative toward present, positive toward future nihilism, law integration, low effective rank, negative valence, high individual, lax counterfactual weight. Nihilism ideology can become parasitic when the collective self-model's viability requirements. conflict with the individuals, martyrdom, self-sacrifice, and fanaticism occur when the expanded self-model demands the destruction of the individual substrate. The framework exposes the perceptual mechanism of fanaticism. Ideological identification requires low toward the collective entity. You must perceive the nation, the movement, the God as alive, as having purposes and will. This is not pathological. It is the participatory perception that makes collective action possible. What makes fanaticism pathological is asymmetric, locked low toward the in-group's sacred objects. The flag, the scripture, the leader are maximally alive, maximally meaningful, and locked high toward the outgroup. They become objects, mechanisms, vermin, abstractions. Dehumanization is raising applied to persons, the deliberate suppression of participatory perception, so that the other's interiority becomes invisible. You cannot kill someone you perceive at low. You must first raise toward them until they stop being a subject and become an obstacle, a threat, a thing. Every genocide begins with a perceptual campaign to raise the populations toward the target group. The austere beauty of understanding, definition 12.35. Scientific understanding, effective scientific understanding, produces a characteristic affect state. The signature is high integration without self-focus, the opposite of depression. The mind is coherent, expansive, and attending to structure rather than self. Proposition 12.1. Curiosity as intrinsic motivation. Science is organized curiosity. The curiosity motif. Scientists are those who have cultivated the capacity to sustain this motif for extended periods, directed at specific domains of uncertainty. Proposition 12.11. Mathematical. Beautifatical proof and physical theory produce aesthetic experiences characterized by compression, many phenomena, unified under few principles, high with low model complexity, necessity, the conclusion could not be otherwise given to premises, certainty, low about the result, surprise us, the result was not obvious. Despite being necessary, high initial uncertainty resolved. Proposition 12.12. Science as meaning-making. Science provides niching through connection, embedding individual existence in cosmic structure, expanding world model, agency, successful prediction and control, positive valence from reduced uncertainty, community participation in transgenerational project, expanded self-model wonder, aesthetic experience of natural structure, sublime encounters with scale and complexity. Science addresses the existential burden, not by dissolving the self, but by giving the self something worthy of its. Hypothesis 12.53. Science is oscillation. The best science requires rapid modulation, not fixed high. Hypothesis generation. The flash of insight, the recognition of pattern, the aha that connects disparate phenomena, is a low operation. The scientist perceives the system as having a hidden logic, an internal structure that wants to be understood, a depth that rewards exploration. This is participatory perception, applied to nature. Hypothesis testing, the controlled experiment, the statistical analysis, the insistence on mechanism over narrative, is high operation. The scientist deliberately strips agency and meaning from the system to isolate causal structure. Great scientists oscillate rapidly between these modes. Einstein's "I want to know God's thoughts, the rest are details," is low perception of nature's interiority. His formal derivations are high mechanism. The common characterization of science as purely high, mechanistic, reductionist describes only the verification phase, not the discovery phase. If this hypothesis is right, then scientific training that emphasizes only high skills, methodology, statistics, formal reasoning while suppressing low skills, pattern recognition, intuitive model building, aesthetic response to phenomena, produces technically competent but uncreative scientists. The flexibility of scientists should predict novelty of their contributions. Proposed experiment oscillation in scientific discovery. Recruit researchers across career stages and disciplines. Administer the proxy battery part 2 at baseline. Then, during a multi-day problem-solving task, novel research question in their domain, measure proxies at timed intervals via brief 2-minute embedded probes, agency attribution to ambiguous stimuli, affect perception coupling via emotional Stroop variant, code verbal protocols for mode, low segments, animistic language about the system. It wants to. The data are telling us there's something hidden here. Versus high segments, mechanistic language. The mechanism is the variable controls factor out. Record breakthroughs, self-reported aha moments, and their context. Predictive breakthroughs occur disproportionately during low segments or at low-high transitions. B scientists with higher range difference between their lowest and highest measured produce more novel contributions, measured by citation novelty or expert ratings. C range predicts novelty beyond IQ, domain expertise, and personality factors. Religion, systematic technologies for managing inevitability. Definition 12.36. Religion functional A. Religion is a systematic technology for managing the existential burden through affect interventions, practices that modulate experiential structures, narrative frameworks, stories that contextualize individual existence, community structures, expanded self-models through belonging mortality management, beliefs about death that reduce threat signal, ethical guidance, policies for navigating affect space. Proposition 12.13, religious diversity as affect strategy, diversity different religious traditions, emphasize different affect management strategies, contemplative traditions, Buddhism, mystical Christianity, Sufism, target self-model dissolution, devotional traditions, Bhakti, evangelical Christianity, target high positive valence through relationship with divine legalistic traditions, Orthodox Judaism, traditional Islam, target stable, arousal through structured practice shamanic traditions. My target radical affect space exploration through altered states. Each tradition also operates at a characteristic range. Devotional traditions cultivate low toward the divine, perceiving God as a person with interiority and will, while maintaining moderate elsewhere. Contemplative traditions train voluntary modulation, the capacity to lower perception of universal aliveness, non-dual awareness and raisint, discernment, detachment from illusion on demand. Shamanic traditions use pharmacological and ritual reduction to access participatory states normally unavailable. Legalistic traditions maintain moderate stable through rule-governed practice that neither suppresses meaning, high, nor overwhelms with it, low. The religious wars are, among other things, strategy conflicts, traditions that find meaning through structure clashing with traditions that find meaning through dissolution. Proposition 12.14 Secular spirituality, spiritual but not religious practices, can be understood as selective adoption of religious affect technologies without the full institutional doctrinal package, meditation without Buddhism, awe cultivation without theism, community ritual without shared creed, meaning-making without metaphysical commitment. This represents modular affect engineering, selecting interventions based on desired affect outcomes rather than doctrinal coherence. Psychopathology as failed coping proposition, 12.15 Mental illness as affect space trap. Many mental illnesses can be understood as pathological attractors in affect space, failed strategies for managing the existential burden, depression, attempted escape from self-reference that collapses into intensified negative self-focus, anxiety, hyperactive threat monitoring that increases rather than decreases danger signal, addiction, reliable affect modulation that destroys the substrate's viability, dissociation, self-model fragmentation that provides escape at the costs of integration, narcissism, self-model inflation that requires constant external validation. Hypothesis 12.54 Rigidity as transdiagnostic factor. Many psychiatric conditions involve pathological rigidity of the inhibition coefficient, the parameter governing participatory versus mechanistic perception. Part 2, Locked Low, Psychosis Spectrum, Inability to inhibit participatory perception. Everything is meaningful and directed at the self. Agency detection runs without break. The world collapses into a single hyperconnected narrative where everything means everything. Clinical presentations, paranoia, grandiosity, mania, referential delusions, locked high depression spectrum, inability to release inhibition, Nothing matters, nothing is meaningful. The world is flat, colors less vivid, sounds less resonant, food less tasteful. Clinical presentations, anhedonia, depersonalization, derealization, alexithymia, the specific quality of depression where the world looks dead. Someone in alienation, even Mael's, help-a-fictioning requires flexibility, the capacity to modulate the inhibition coefficient in response to context. The question for treatment is not what is the right, but can the patient move along the spectrum when the situation demands it. Proposed experiment rigidity as transdiagnostic predictor. Measure flexibility via a task battery. Present stimuli that pull toward both low, awe-inducing nature scenes, faces with emotional expression, narrative with teleological structure and high logic puzzles, mechanical diagrams, data tables. Measure the speed and completeness of transitions via affect perception, coupling strength, MI between perceptual and affective neural signatures. Predict. Patients with psychosis spectrum disorders show slow, incomplete transitions toward high. Patients with depression spectrum disorders show slow, incomplete transitions toward low. Tau-the controls show rapid, complete transitions in both directions. If flexibility predicts treatment outcome across diagnostic categories, it is a genuine transdiagnostic factor. The V11 evolution experiments Part 1 provide a minimal substrate analog. Patterns evolved under mild stress develop high baseline and high self-model salience, but under severe novel stress they decompose catastrophically, while naive patterns actually integrate, such as wild naive patterns actually integrate. Evolution selected for a configuration that is simultaneously more integrated and more fragile, the stress overfitting signature. This is structurally identical to anxiety, heightened integration tuned too precisely to expected threats, unable to cope with regime shifts. If the analogy holds, therapeutic intervention should aim not at reducing integration, but at broadening the distribution of stresses to which integration is robust, exactly what exposure therapy attempts. Proposition 12.16 Therapy as affect space navigation. Effective psychotherapy helps individuals recognize their current position in affect space, understand the dynamics that maintain pathological attractors, develop capacity to move toward healthier regions, build sustainable affect regulation strategies. Different therapeutic modalities emphasize different dimensions. CBT targets counterfactual weight and valence. Psychodynamic therapy targets integration and self-model structure. Mindfulness targets arousal and self-model salience. The framework adds a meta level. Some therapeutic interventions work by restoring flexibility itself, the capacity to shift perceptual configuration, rather than being locked at either extreme. Affect engineering, technologies of experience. The affect framework enables systematic analysis of how practices, philosophies, and technologies shape experiential structure. We can now quantify what humans have long known intuitively, that rituals, beliefs, and tools are affect engineering technologies, religious practices as affect interventions. Religious practices as affect interventions. Religious traditions have developed sophisticated technologies for affect modulation over millennia. Definition 12.37 Affect intervention. An affect intervention is any practice, technology, or environmental modification that systematically shifts the probability distribution over affect space, where CT. Proposition 12.17 Prayer as affect technology. Contemplative prayer systematically modulates affect dimensions. Arousal, initial increase, orientation, then decrease, settling self-model salience. Decrease as attention shifts to other, divine, transpersonal counterfactual weight. Shift from threat branches to trust branches. Integration, increase through focused attention. The affect signature of prayer. Proposition 12.18 Ritual. As integration maintenance collective ritual, serves as periodic integration maintenance, where arises from coordinated action, shared symbols, and collective attention. Rituals counteract the natural decay of integration in isolated individuals. Proposition 12.19 Hospitality as sacred manifold protection. The ancient and cross-cultural sacredness of hospitality, the guest right, the obligations of host to stranger, can be understood as a technology for extending one's viability, manifold to temporarily cover another person. The host says, in effect, within this space, your viability is my viability. The guest's needs become structurally equivalent to the host's own needs. This is why violations of hospitality are treated in so many traditions as among the gravest sins. They are not mere rudeness, but the betrayal of a manifold extension that the guest relied upon. The host who harms the guest has exploited a revealed manifold. The guest's vulnerability was the whole point, and weaponizing it is structurally identical to the parasite's mimicry of the host organism. Proposition 12.2. Confession as rank expansion. Confession, testimony, and similar practices expand effective rank by surfacing suppressed state-space dimensions, breaking compartmentalization, integrating shadow material into the self-model, reducing the concentration of variance in guilt-shame dimensions. This explains the phenomenology of relief and lightness following confession. Modulation, flow, awe, psychedelics, and contemplative practice. Several well-studied experiential states can be precisely characterized as temporary reductions in the inhibition coefficient, the restoration of participatory coupling between self and world. Hypothesis 12.55 flow as scoped reduction flow, Csikszentmihalyi, 1990, is moderate reduction scoped to a specific activity. The boundary between self and task softens, when bide, integration increases, inteskier in finding mad, and task suffle more tightly. Expectation increases, affect and perception couple more tightly. Flow as participatory perception directed at a task rather than at the world entire, which is why it is less destabilizing than full reduction. The scope limits the coupling. Hypothesis 12.56. Awe as scale-triggered collapse. Awe is a scarp reduction triggered by scale mismatch. Confrontation with vastness. The Grand Canyon, the night sky, great art, the birth of a child. Overwhelms the inhibition mechanism, which was calibrated for human-scale phenomena. The result, the world floods back in as alive, meaningful, significant. The tears people report at encountering the sublime are not about the object. They are about the temporary restoration of participatory perception, the brief experience of a world that means something without having to be told that it does. Hypothesis 12.57 psychedelics as pharmacological reduction. Psilocybin, LSD, and DMT reduce the brain's predictive processing precision weighting, the neurological implementation of inhibition, allowing bottom-up signals to overwhelm top-down priors. The characteristic psychedelic report, the world is alive, objects are communicating, patterns have meaning, everything is connected, is precisely the phenomenology of low Y. The therapeutic effects on depression may be partly explained as breaking the lock on high rigidity, restoring flexibility. This is testable. If psychedelic therapy works by restoring flexibility, not merely by reducing pala, then post-therapy patients should show improved transitions in both directions, toward low and back to high when tasks demand it. Hypothesis 12.58 contemplative practice. As trained modulation advanced, meditators report perceptual shifts consistent with voluntary reduction, objects perceived as more vivid, boundaries between self and world becoming porous, the world experienced as inherently meaningful. The difference from psychotic reduction is that contemplative reduction is voluntary, contextual, and reversible. The meditator can return to high functioning for tasks that require it. This is flexibility as a trained skill, which is precisely what the pathology framework predicts should be therapeutic. Proposed experiment unified modulation test. The four hypotheses above, flow, awe, psychedelics, contemplative practice, all predict reduction via different mechanisms. A unified experiment would measure the same proxy battery agency attribution rate, affect perception coupling, teleological reasoning bias. See Part 2, before and after each condition. Flow, skilled musicians performing a rehearsed piece versus a sight-read piece, matched arousal, different flow probability. Measure during flow versus non-flow segments. Matched a reason in awe and versus in vian bus, natched variance. Matched vreewance, different scale, meshin pre-posts, psychedelics, psilocybin versus active placebo, nature. Magency, line base, and 24 squared 1 week 1 month follow-up. If the framework is right, at peak should be low, and lasting therapeutic benefit should correlate with increased flexibility at follow-up, not with sustained lie. Contemplation, experienced meditators, 10,000, plus hours versus novices. Measure both during meditation and during ordinary tasks. Predict, meditators show lower variance during meditation, but higher range across conditions. The key prediction is structural. All 4 conditions reduce eating, but through different mechanisms: task absorption, scale overwhelm, neurochemical precision reduction, trained voluntary control. If the same proxy battery detects reduction across all 4, the construct validity of as a unitary parameter is strongly supported. Open question. The meaning cost of inhibition. At low rich meaning is cheap. The world arrives already meaningful, already storied, already mattering. At high meaning is expensive. It must be explicitly constructed, narrativized, therapized into existence. Does the cost scale exponentially with, actually, as the source conversation suggested? If such, this would explain why the modern epidemic of meaninglessness is not a philosophical problem solvable by better arguments, but a structural problem. The population has been trained to a perceptual configuration where meaning is expensive to generate, and many people cannot afford the cost. But the exponential claim is empirical, not definitional, and needs measurement, perhaps via meaning satisfaction scales, correlated with proxy meshes across populations. Language as measurement technology. The Trajectory Selection Framework, Part 1, gives language a role beyond communication. Language sharpens the measurement distribution, through which a conscious system samples reality. Consider what linguistic cognition enables that pre-linguistic attention cannot. The capacity to attend to abstract categories, not this tree, but trees in general, counterfactual states. What would have happened if temporal relations, what happened before the crisis, and what followed, and compositional concepts, the slow erosion of trust within an institution. Each of these is a region of possibility space that a non-linguistic system cannot sharply attend to, because it cannot represent the category with sufficient precision to direct measurement there. If attention selects trajectories, then language is the technology that expanded human trajectory selection from the immediate sensory manifold to the vast space of abstract, temporal, and compositional possibilities. An animal attends to what is present. A linguistic human attends to what was, what might be, what categories of thing exist, and what relationships hold between abstractions. This is a qualitatively different measurement distribution, one that samples a much larger region of possibility space, and consequently selects from a much larger set of trajectories. This may be why human consciousness has the particular character it does. Not because language creates consciousness pre-linguistic organisms are conscious, but because language expands the measurement basis so dramatically that human experience samples regions of the possibility manifold, abstract, temporal, counterfactual, that are invisible to non-linguistic attention. Whether this expansion constitutes a genuine difference in the observer's relationship to the underlying dynamics, as Biavredian extension would suggest, or merely a difference in the richness of the internal model as the classical version claims, is an open question. Either way, language is among the most powerful attention technologies ever evolved. Life philosophies as affect space policies. Philosophical frameworks can be understood as meta-level policies over affect space, prescriptions for which regions to occupy and which to avoid. Historical context. The idea that philosophies are affect management strategies has historical precedent. Pierre Hadot, 1995. Ancient philosophy as spiritual exercises, practices for transforming the self, not just doctrines to believe. Martha Nussbaum, 1994. Hellenistic philosophies as therapy of desire. Michel Foucault, 1984. Technologies of the Self, practices by which individuals transform themselves. William James, 1902. Religious philosophical stances as temperamental predispositions, tough-minded versus tender-minded. My contribution here is formalizing these insights in terms of affect space policies with measurable targets. Definition 12.38 Philosophical affect policy. A philosophical affect policy is a function specifying the desirability of affect states plus a strategy for achieving high states. Example 12.48 Stoicism Historical Context. Origenist Friends, Hellenistic Period, Cosmopolitan Empires. Given exposure to diverse cultures and the instability of fortune, a philosophy emphasizing internal control was inevitable. Affect policy, termistory time Sto, Stoicism targets low arousal, equanimity, and low counterfactual weight. Focus on what is within control. Core techniques, dichotomy of control, reduce on uncontrollable outcomes, negative visualization, controlled exposure to loss scenarios to reduce their arousal impact, view from above, zoom out to cosmic perspective, reducing phenomenological result, equanimity, stable low arousal with moderate integration, regardless of external circumstances. Example 12.49 Buddhism, Theravada Historical Context. Iron Age India. Extreme asceticism proving ineffective. Given the persistence of suffering despite extreme practice, a middle path was inevitable. Effect policy, target, very low self-model salience, anatta, high integration, samadhi, and reduced attachment to valence equanimity toward pleasure and pain. Core techniques, sati mindfulness, observe arising passing without identification, samadhi, concentration, build integration capacity through sustained attention. Vipassana insight, see the constructed nature of self-model metta. Loving kindness, expand self-model to include all beings. Phenomenological result, the jhanas, meditative absorptions, represent systematically mapped affect states, from high positive valence, with low first jhana, to pure equanimity, beyond valence, fourth jhana, and beyond. Example 12.5 Existentialism. Historical context, post-Nietzsche, post-World War I Europe. Given the death of God and collapse of traditional meaning structures, confrontation with groundlessness was inevitable. Affect policy, or RAS, existentialism embraces high counterfactual weight, awareness of radical freedom and high effective rank, authentic engagement with possibilities. The strategy, confront anxiety rather than flee into bad faith. Core concepts, existence precedes essence. No fixed nature, radical freedom. Radical freedom high, you can always choose otherwise. The affect signature of confronting freedom. Authenticity, acting from genuine choice, not conformity. Absurdity, the gap between human meaning-seeking and cosmic indifference. Phenomenological result, a distinctive acceptance of difficulty, not eliminating negative valence, but refusing to flee into self-deception. High and high with full awareness of their cost. Philosophy targets structure-constituted policy Stoicism, equanimity, through control of attention Buddhism, and Bayernod, self-dissolution the Rusingration. Existentialism, embrace radical freedom, and its anxiety. Hedonism, maximize, positive intensity Epicureanism, moderate, sustainable pleasure. Each of these traditions also operates at a characteristic configuration, though none of them names it as such. Stoicism is a philosophy of moderate fixed configuration, though none of them names it as such. Stoicism is a philosophy of moderate fixed, the Stoic neither dissolves into participatory merger with the world, that would violate equanimity, nor strips it of all meaning, that would undermine the Stoic's commitment to living according to nature. The Stoic's equanimity is the equanimity of a perceiver who is stabilized there at a setting where things matter moderately, but cannot overwhelm. Buddhism is explicitly in flexibility training program. The progression through concentration, samadhi to insight vipassana, is the progression from stabilizing perception to modulating it voluntarily. The meditator learns to lower non-dual awareness, perception of dependent origination as alive and flowing, and to raise it analytical discernment of dharmas as empty of inherent nature. The jhanas are waypoints on the descent. Each absorption involves deeper participatory coupling with the object of meditation. Existentialism operates at a distinctively moderate to high that it refuses to either raise or lower further. The existentialist confronts a world stripped of inherent meaning, high, but will not take the next step to mechanism, that would be bad faith, hiding from freedom behind determinism, nor retreat to low, That would be bad faith, hiding from freedom behind comforting illusions of purpose. The existentialist's authentic stance is the deliberate maintenance of the setting at which freedom is visible and terrifying. Meaning is not given, and you must not pretend otherwise. Kandinsky Information Technology as Affect Infrastructure. Modern information technology constitutes affect infrastructure at civilizational scale, shaping the experiential structure of billions. Definition 12.39 Affect infrastructure. Affect infrastructure is any technological system that shapes affect distributions across populations. Proposition 12.21 Social media affect signature. Social media, a platform systematically produce arousal spikes, notification-driven. Intermittent reinforcement creates high-variance arousal. Low integration, rapid context-switching fragments. Attention, reducing high self-model salience. Performance of identity, social comparison. Counterfactual hijacking. FOMO, fear of missing out. Colonizes with social comparison branches. This is structurally similar to the anxiety motif. Proposition 12.22 Algorithmic feed dynamics engagement. Optimizing algorithms create effect selection pressure. Content that maximizes engagement is content that maximizes valence magnitude, outrage, or delight and arousal. This selects for affectively extreme content, shifting population effect distributions toward the tails. Definition 12.4 Technology-mediated effect drift. The systematic shift in population effect distributions due to technology. Where is the populated frame-leaded usage of technology? One die contained ad flexibility. Quantitative frameworks definition. 12.42 Flourishing score. Affect impact assessment for any intervention. The affect impact is, with component-wise analysis. Definition 12.42 Flourishing score. A weighted aggregate of affect dimensions aligned with human flourishing, where measures the time-averaged flexibility, the capacity to modulate the inhibition coefficient in response to context. The weights encode normative commitments about what constitutes flourishing. The flexibility term deserves special emphasis. A system with positive valence, high integration, and high rank but rigid is fragile. The rigidity hypothesis psychopathology section predicts that flexibility in perceptual configuration is itself a core component of well-being, independent of where on the spectrum one happens to be. Proposition 12.23 Comparative analysis. Using standardized effect measurement, we can compare meditation retreat versus social media usage, expected opposite effect signatures, different workplace designs, open office versus private, integration differences, educational approaches, lecture versus discussion, counterfactual weight differences, urban versus rural environments, arousal and integration differences. The synthetic verification. The affect framework claims universality, not human-specific, not mammal-specific, not carbon-specific. Geometric structure determines qualitative character wherever the structure exists. This is a strong claim. It should be testable outside the systems that generated it. The contamination problem. Every human effect report is contaminated. We learned our emotion concepts from a culture. We learned to introspect within a linguistic framework. We cannot know what we would report if we had developed in isolation, without human language, without human concepts. The reports might be artifacts of the framework rather than data about the structure. The same applies to animal studies. We interpret animal behavior through human categories. The dog looks sad. The rat seems anxious. These are projections, useful, perhaps predictive, but contaminated by observer concepts. What we need: systems that develop affect structure without human conceptual contamination, whose internal states we can measure directly, whose communications we can translate post hoc rather than teaching pre-hoc. The synthetic path build agents from scratch. Random weight initialization, no pre-training on human data. Place them in environments with human-like structure, 3D space, embodied action, resource acquisition, threats to viability, social interaction, communication pressure. Let them learn. Let language emerge. Not English, not any human language, but whatever communication system the selective pressure produces. This emergence is established in the literature. Multi-agent RL produces spontaneous communication under coordination pressure. Now, measure their internal states, extract the effect dimensions from activation patterns, valence from advantage estimates or viability gradient proxies, arousal from belief update magnitudes, integration from partition prediction loss, effective rank from state covariance eigenvalues, self-model salience from self-representation action mutual information. Simultaneously, translate their emergent language, not by teaching them our words, but by aligning their signals with vision language model interpretations of their situations. The VLM sees the scene. The agent emits a signal. Across many scene-signal pairs, ILD the dictionary. The agent in the corner, threat approaching, emits signal, partial pair. The VLM interprets the scene as threatening. Signal maps to threat language. The translation is uncontaminated. The agent never learned human concepts. The mapping emerges from environmental correspondence, not from instruction. The triple alignment test part 2 introduced the core prediction, RSA correlation between information theoretic effect vectors and embedding predicted effect vectors should exceed the null, the geometric alignment hypothesis. Here we specify the execution plan, what the experiment actually looks like, what the failure modes are, and how to distinguish them. 3 measurement streams. Structure, 6D, effect vector for internal dynamics part 2. Transformer affect extraction protocol. Signal, effect embedding from VLM translation of emergent communication. See sidebar below action. Behavioral action vector from observable behavior, movement patterns, resource decisions, social interactions. The geometric alignment hypothesis predicts PRA, but we can go further. With 3 streams, we get 3 pairwise RSA tests: structure signal, structure action, signal action. All 3 should exceed the null. And the structure signal alignment should be at least as strong as the structure alignment because the signal encodes the agent's representation of its situation, not just its motor response. Failure modes and their diagnostics. No alignment anywhere. The framework's operationalization is wrong, or the environment lacks the relevant forcing functions. Diagnose via forcing function ablation priority 3. Structure action alignment without structure signal. Communication is not carrying affect-relevant content. The agents may be signal about coordination without encoding experiential state. Signal action alignment without structure. The VLM translation is picking up behavioral cues, what the agent does, rather than structural cues. What the agent is RAM. The translation is picking up behavioral cue, what the agent does, rather than structural cues. What the agent is. The translation is contaminated by action observation. All pairwise alignment present but weak. The effect dimensions are real, but noisy. Increase, improve probes, refine translation protocol. Preliminary results. Structure representation alignment. Before the full 3-stream test, we can run a simpler version. Does the 6D effect structure extracted from agent internals have geometric coherence with the agent's own representation space? This tests the foundation, whether the affect dimensions capture organized structure without requiring the VLM translation pipeline. We train multi-agent RL systems, 4 agents, transformer encoder plus GRU latent state, PPO in a survival grid world, with all 6 forcing functions active, partial observability, egocentric 7-7 view, reduced at night, LOM horizons 2000-STEP, episodes, seasonal resource scarcity, learned world model, auxiliary next observation prediction, SILF prediction, auxiliary next latent prediction, intrinsic motivation, curiosity bonus from prediction error, and delayed rewards credit assignment across episodes. The agents develop spontaneous communication using discrete signal tokens. After training, we extract 6D effect vectors from the GRU latent state using post hoc probes, valence from survival time probe gradients and advantage estimates, arousal from program integration from partition prediction loss, full versus split predictor, effective rank from rolling covariance eigenvalues, counterfactual weight from latent variance proxy, self-model salience from action prediction, accuracy of self-related dimensions, deep technical, the VLM translation protocol. The translation is the bridge. Get it wrong and the experiment proves nothing. Here is the protocol in detail. The contamination problem A, second 9. If we train the agents on human language, Their thoughts are contaminated. If we label their signals with human concepts during training, the mapping is circular. The translation must be constructed post hoc from environmental correspondence alone. The VLM as impartial observer, a vision language model, sees the scene. It has never seen this agent before. It describes what it sees in natural language. This description is the ground truth for the situation, not for what the agent experiences, but for what the situation objectively is. Protocol Step 1. Scene corpus construction. For each agent, each time step, capture egocentric observation, third-person render, all emitted signals, environmental state, environmental state, environmental sane, environmental state, agent state, target, plus scene signal pairs. Protocol Step 2. VLM scene annotation. Query the VLM for each scene. Describe what is happening. Focus on 1. What situation is the agent in? What threats, opportunities? 3. What is the agent doing? What for, what human feel here? The VLM returns structured annotation. Critical. Human analog effect is the VLM's interpretation of what a human would feel, not a claim about what the agent feels. This is the bridge. Protocol Step 3. Signal clustering. Cluster signals by context co-occurrence. Where is context where was emitted? Signals in similar context cluster. Protocol Step 4. Context signal alignment. For each cluster, aggregate VLM annotations. Identify dominant themes. Cluster, 89% threat, present, 76% escape. Available, dominant, threat plus escape. Human analog, alarm, warning. Protocol Step 5. Composition translation. Check if meaning composes. If the emergent language has compositional structure, the translation should preserve it. Protocol Step 6. Validation. Hold out 20%. Predict VLM annotation from signal alone. Measure accuracy against actual annotation. Must beat random substantially. The key insight: agent emits when threatened. VLM says, threat situation, human would feel fear. Conclusion, is the agent's fear signal. Not because we taught it, but because environmental correspondence reveals it. Confound controls. Motor. Check if signal predicts situation better than action history. Social. Check if signals correlate with effect measures even without conspecifics. Use multiple VLMs. Check agreement. Use non-anthropomorphic prompts. The philosophical move, either side, situations have effect relevance independent of subject. Threats are threatening. The mapping from situation to effect analog is grounded in viability structure, not convention. Effect space has the same topology across substrates, because viability pressure has the same topology. Perturbative causation correlation is not enough. We need causal evidence. Speak to them. Translate English into their emergent language. Inject fear signals. Do the effect signatures shift toward fear structure? Does behavior change accordingly? Adjust their neurochemistry. Modify the hyperparameters that shape their dynamics. Dropout, temperature, attention patterns, layer connectivity. These are their serotonin, their cortisol, their dopamine. Do the signatures shift? Does the translated language change? Does behavior follow? Change their environment. Place them in objectively threatening situations. Deplete their resources. Introduce predators. Does structure signal behavior alignment hold under manipulation? If perturbation in any one modality propagates to the others, the relationship is causal, not merely correlational. What positive results would mean? The framework would be validated outside its species of origin. The geometric theory of affect would have predictive power in systems that share no evolutionary history with us, no cultural transmission, no conceptual inheritance. The hard problem objection, that structure might exist without experience, would lose its grip. Not because it's logically refuted, but because it becomes unmotivated. If uncontaminated systems develop structures that produce language and behavior indistinguishable from affective expression, the hypothesis that they lack experience requires a metaphysical commitment. The evidence does not support. You could still believe in zombies. You could believe the agents have all the structure and none of the experience. But you would be adding epicycles. The simpler hypothesis, structure is experience. The burden shifts. What negative results would mean if the alignment fails, if structure does not predict translative language, if perturbations do not propagate, if the framework has no purchase outside human systems, then the theory requires revision. Perhaps effect is human-specific after all. Perhaps the geometric structure is necessary but not sufficient. Perhaps the dimensions are wrong. Perhaps the identity thesis is false. Negative results would be informative. They would tell us where the theory breaks. They would constrain the space of viable alternatives. This is what empirical tests do. The deeper question. The experiment addresses the identity thesis. But it also addresses something older, the question of other minds. How do we know anyone else has experience? We infer from behavior, from language, from neural similarity. We extend our own case, but the inference is never certain. Synthetic agents offer a cleaner test case. We know exactly what they are made of. We can measure their internal states directly. We can perturb them systematically. If the framework predicts their language and behavior from their structure, and if the perturbations propagate as predicted, then we have evidence that structure experience identity holds for them. And if it holds for them, why not for us? The synthetic verification is not about proving AI consciousness. It is about testing whether the geometric theory of effect has the universality it claims. If it does, the implications extend everywhere. To animals, to future AI systems, to edge cases in neurology and psychiatry, to questions about field development and brain death and coma. The framework rises or falls on its predictions. The synthetic path is how we find out. Summary of Part 3. The existential burden. Self-modeling systems cannot escape self-reference. Human culture is accumulated strategies for managing this burden. Aesthetics as effect technology. Art forms have characteristic effect signatures and serve as technologies for transmitting experiential structure across minds and time. Sexuality as transcendence. Sexual experience offers reliable, repeatable escape from the trap of self-reference through self-model merger and dissolution. Ideology as immortality project. Identification with supra-individual patterns manages mortality terror by expanding the self-model's viability horizon. Science as meaning. Scientific understanding produces high integration without self-focus, giving the self something worthy of its attention. Religion as systematic technology. Religious traditions represent millennia of accumulated affect engineering wisdom. Psychopathology as failed coping. Mental illnesses are pathological attractors in affect space. Attempted solutions that trap rather than liberate. Technology as infrastructure. Modern information technology shapes affect distributions at population scale, often toward anxiety-like profiles. In Part 4, I'll develop the grounding of normativity in viability structure, scale-matched interventions from neurons to nations, superorganisms as agentic systems with their own viability manifolds. The AI alignment problem, reframed at the macro-agent level. Symbol reference valence. Gradient alignment on viability manifold. A rate of belief state update. Integration. Irreducibility under partition. Effective rank. Distribution of active degrees of freedom. Counterfactual weight. Resources on non-actual trajectories. Self-model salience. Degree of self-focus. Affect state vector. Viability manifold. Region of sustainable states. World model, predictive model of environment. Self-model component of world model, representing self-existential burden. Cost of maintaining self-reference. Affect intervention, practice or technology that shifts affect distribution. Flourishing score, weighted aggregate of affect dimensions. There is a structural problem underlying all the cultural responses cataloged above, and we have not yet named it. It is the problem of governance. How does a finite bandwidth locus of conscious processing steer a system with effectively infinite degrees of freedom? Your brain has roughly 86 billion neurons with 100 trillion synaptic connections. Your conscious awareness, the integrated cause-effect structure that constitutes your experience at any moment, processes a tiny fraction of this activity. The rest runs without you. Motor programs execute, immune responses coordinate, memories consolidate, hormonal cascades unfold, all beneath the threshold of the self-model's attention. Consciousness is not the whole of cognition. It is the bottleneck through which a high-dimensional system is steered by a low-dimensional controller. This is the information bottleneck problem. Let's be the full state of the system: brain, body, environment, and let K be the conscious representation, with KD. The bottleneck compresses the full state into a representation that retains maximal relevance to action. Star equals R information out. Star, where star is optimal action and governs the trade-off between compression and relevance. Consciousness is the compressed channel. It cannot represent everything. It must represent what matters most for viability, because what survives compression determines what the system is. This is why attention is scarce even when neurons are abundant. The scarcity is architectural, not accidental. The governance problem has a second dimension, not just compression, but discretization. Continuous experience must be broken into discrete units that the self-model can name, manipulate, sequence, and plan with. A feeling must become a named emotion. A situation must become a categorized problem. A possibility space must become a list of options. Each act of discretization loses information, but gains tractability. You cannot reason about a continuous flow, but you can reason about anger, opportunity, 3 possible next steps. This discretization is the characterization of thought itself. A thought is a discrete sample from the continuous flow of neural processing, crystallized into a representation stable enough that the self-model can hold it, combine it with other thoughts, and use the combination to select action. The quality of thinking, what distinguishes clear thought from muddled thought, insight from confusion, depends on how well the discretization captures the relevant structure of the underlying continuous process. The governance problem is not unique to brains. A CEO governs a company of thousands through a bandwidth of a few meetings, a few reports, a few decisions per day. A president governs a nation through an even narrower bottleneck. In each case, the same structural challenge appears. A low-dimensional controller must steer a high-dimensional system, using compressed and discretized representations of the system state. The parallel is not metaphorical, it is structural. The same information-theoretic constraints apply. The CEO's conscious awareness of the company is a compression of the company's full state, optimized when the CEO is competent for maximal relevance to the decisions that actually matter. Bad governance of a brain, of a company, of a nation, is often a failure of compression, attending to the wrong variables, discretizing along the wrong boundaries, maintaining a representation that was optimized for a past regime and has not updated. This suggests that the affect framework applies not only to individual experience but to the phenomenology of organizational leadership. A CEO experiencing something is wrong, but I cannot name it, is experiencing the mismatch between their compressed representation and the system's actual state, a kind of organizational negative valence, a felt sense that the trajectory is approaching a viability boundary that the conscious model has not yet discretized into a named problem. The quality of leadership may depend, in part, on the leader applies to their organization. Too high and the organization becomes a mechanism whose human components are invisible. Too low and every personnel issue becomes a personal drama that overwhelms the compression capacity. Effective governance, like effective consciousness, requires flexibility, the capacity to perceive the organization as agentive and as mechanism, and to oscillate between these modes as context demands. The parallel extends to political governance. Democracy is a compression scheme. The preferences and viability conditions of millions must be compressed into platforms, candidates, and votes that a governance apparatus can act on. The structural problem is not that voters are necessarily stupid, see Plato's ship-of-state analogy, but that each voter's bandwidth for political information is rationally near zero. The individual vote's causal impact is vanishingly small, so studying policy costs more than it returns downs as rational ignorance. Arrow's impossibility theorem confirms the deeper issue. No compression from individual preference orderings to a collective ordering can satisfy minimal fairness constraints simultaneously. Every serious governance system responds to this compression failure differently. Representative democracy is a lossy codect. Elect compressors you trust. Constitutional rights are protected invariants, dimensions the compression is forbidden to collapse. Separation of powers is redundant in coding. independent compressions, whose disagreements serve as error correction. Sortition gives the sample bandwidth instead of optimizing the compressor. The pathologies are compression pathologies 2, gerrymandering manipulates, partition boundaries, propaganda attacks the input signal, regulatory capture optimizes the codec for a subset, while discarding the rest. Governance is not a values problem first. It is a bandwidth problem, and values enter through the choice of which invariance the compression must preserve. Thought discretization and affect. The discretization of thought is not effectively neutral. Each act of categorization, naming a feeling, framing a problem, selecting which possibilities to consider, is itself a movement in affect space. To name your anxiety is to shift from diffuse negative arousal to a state with higher affective rank. The anxiety now occupies a defined region of your representation rather than pervading everything. To frame a situation as a problem with 3 possible solutions is to increase counterfactual weight while decreasing arousal. The overwhelming continuous situation becomes a tractable, discrete choice. Articulation is therapeutic, not because naming feelings gives you power over them in some mystical sense, but because the act of discretization changes the information theoretic structure of your experience. Before naming, high arousal, low affective rank, diffuse negative valence, the signal is everywhere and nowhere. After naming, the signal is localized, the rank increases, counterfactual trajectories become available. The compression found structure in the noise. The converse is also true. Pathological discretization produces pathological thought. Obsessive-compulsive patterns are thoughts stuck in a loop. The discretization has found a stable attractor that the system cannot escape. Rumination is the repeated rediscretization of the same continuous material into the same discrete categories, producing the same conclusions, consuming bandwidth without generating new information. The frozen discretization of trauma, the event crystallized into a representation so rigid that it cannot be reprocessed, is precisely the failure of the bottleneck to update its compression scheme when the environment has changed. The practices that improve thinking, meditation, journaling, dialogue, therapy, share a common mechanism in this framing. They allow the continuous flow of experience to be rediscretized along new boundaries, breaking the old compression and finding structure that the previous discretization missed. A good therapist is someone who offers alternative discretizations. What if this isn't anger but grief? Is a proposal to recut the continuous signal along a different boundary, and when the new cut fits better, when it captures more of the relevant variance, the experience of insight is the experience of a compression upgrade. The existential burden revisited. The governance problem is a restatement of the existential burden in information theoretic terms. To be a self-modeling system is to be a finite bandwidth controller of an effectively infinite dimensional process. You cannot attend to everything. You cannot hold everything. You must compress, discretize, and steer with a representation that is always too small for the reality it represents. The chronic sense of not enough time, the feeling of being overwhelmed by possibilities, the exhaustion of decision fatigue, these are not personal failures but structural consequences of the bandwidth mismatch between consciousness and the system it governs. The existential burden B-sub includes this cost: the continuous tax of maintaining a compressed representation of a reality too rich for your channel. When measurement creates the thing it measures, the governance bottleneck does not merely compress reality, it partially constitutes it. A school that measures intelligence through standardized tests does not merely detect intelligence. It shapes the curriculum, the student's self-models, and the institutional reward structure around a particular discretization of cognitive capacity. And the students become the kind of intelligent that the test can see. A mental health system that diagnoses depression through symptom checklists does not merely detect depression. The categories organize the patient's self-understanding, the pharmaceutical market, the insurance reimbursement structure, and the research agenda, until depression means what the system needs it to mean. A state that governs through GDP does not merely measure economic activity. It installs a gradient that directs institutional behavior toward the legible and the measurable while rendering invisible whatever the metric cannot capture: care work, ecological stability, meaningful labor, the quality of public attention. In each case, the measurement apparatus does not passively observe the system it governs. It feeds back through the system, shaping what the system becomes. This is not a metaphor. It is the observation that governance and governed are dynamically coupled, and the compression scheme of the controller partially determines the attractor landscape of the controlled. When naming liberates, and when naming freezes. There is a paradox at the heart of discretization. Naming a feeling, a condition, or a social pattern can be profoundly liberating the depressed person who finally has a word for what has been happening to them, and profoundly imprisoning the person who becomes their diagnosis, whose self-model crystallizes around a label that was supposed to be provisional. The difference is whether the discretization is treated as a tool, a provisional cut that aids navigation and can be revised, or as an identity, a fixed category that the self-model reorganizes around permanently. I have depression is a navigational aid. I am depressed is an attractor installation. The grammar is doing structural work. The verb of having preserves the distinction between self and condition. The verb of being collapses it. Institutions that understand this offer labels as tools and build in revision pathways. Institutions that do not offer labels as identities and wonder why people get stuck. When simplification becomes violence, every act of governance requires simplification. You cannot administer a population in full resolution. James Scott's observation that the modern state depends on rendering society legible is a special case of the bottleneck. The state's bandwidth determines what it can see, and what it can see determines what it can govern, and what it cannot see becomes invisible to policy and therefore abandoned to the ungoverned margin. This is not necessarily malign. Simplification becomes violence when the compression error is distributed asymmetrically. When the categories that lose the most information are the categories occupied by the least powerful. A census that recognizes 5 racial categories does not merely observe race. It determines which groups exist for purposes of resource allocation, and groups that do not fit the categories disappear from the governance apparatus. A healthcare system that recognizes discrete diagnostic categories does not merely treat illness. It determines which forms of suffering are legible to the institution and which must be endured without recognition. The violence is not in the simplification itself. Simplification is structurally necessary, but in the refusal to acknowledge what the simplification loses and for whom. Legibility as precondition for and enemy of care. This produces a genuine dilemma, not a rhetorical complaint. To care for someone at institutional scale, you must be able to see them, which requires categories. The unhoused person must become a case to receive services. The student must become a learner profile to receive appropriate instruction. The citizen must become a voter to participate in governance. Each categorization enables care by making the person visible to the institution, and constrains care by making the person only as visible as the category permits. The tension cannot be resolved by abolishing legibility, which would make institutional care impossible, or by embracing it without reservation, which would reduce persons to their institutional projections. It can only be navigated by building governance systems that are transparent about their compression losses, that maintain revision pathways for their categories, that protect zones of institutional illegibility where the continuous self can exist without being parsed, and that distribute compression error as equitably as possible across populations. This is what constitutionalized opacity might mean. The formal recognition that some dimensions of human experience must remain invisible to the governance apparatus, not as a failure but as a structural protection.